podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to And It's Live, your new retro football network. I am Martin Ramsey, your host. The following show, The Main Event, A History of the Champions League, was first recorded on the Heart and Hand Patreon network, so some references to other shows on that platform may not be relevant to you. Myself, Adam Thornton and David Edgar are all Rangers fans and often make the point during these shows that the Rangers' experience in the Champions League, often not a happy one, is covered elsewhere on that platform in great detail. Despite our own fan leanings, these shows are a wider view of one of the most transformative innovations in the history of the game. We look back as football fans first, as history geeks second, and with great love and interest in the subject. We hope that comes through the shows and that you in turn share that enthusiasm. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Main Event, our Champions League history show here on Heart and Hand, and we are now into 1994-95. Some new faces join the party, and we'll discuss a lot of those over the course of the next 2 weeks. I'm joined as always by Mr. Adam Thornton, the man who invented this concept. How are we?
I'm very good, thank you, Martin.
We'll get something out of you this week, but I know you're just warming up for next week's Ajax presentation that you got lined up. David Edgar as well.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, this I vividly remember this game. I was a huge Stone Roses fan, Martin, and they were just about to release their second album after 5 years from their debut, where they'd been away, and the anticipation was huge. And I read an interview with them in the NME, and all they talked about was they were going to Barcelona to watch Manchester United. So the game is seared into my memory.
And because United make their proper debut in the Champions League, we have a special guest from The Guardian and Wisden and all sorts of other publications. Mr. Rob Smythe, how are we, Rob?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Hopefully, there's some happy memories here. Maybe not completely happy for you, but
all part of a bigger story.
It is indeed. It is indeed. It got to its destination finally. We'll start with you then, Rob, because United are in here properly for the first time, as I said. Maybe thankful, no Galatasaray-esque experience to overcome, because Manchester United, along with a few other big clubs from big countries, went straight into the Champions League for the first time. We had 4 groups, and we had 2 seeds already taking their place, and a qualifying round where the teams involved in the qualifying round knew what group they were going into, so everything was kind of pre-drawn. And yes, Rangers fans, go to Dominant if you really want to relive the horrors of Athens and Ike and everything. Walter's decision at the very last minute to try 3 at the back for the very first time, and Gary Stevens on the left-hand side of a back 3, which was remarkable indeed. And we would have been drawn in AC Milan and Ajax's group, as it would happen. We didn't have to worry about that. But Rob, United were there with Barcelona, with Gothenburg, and your old friends from Turkey. Before we go into it, can you just remember that? Was there a sense of relief that you didn't have that trouble to overcome again? Because that was quite traumatic. We discussed that a couple of weeks ago. That the events in Turkey.
Yeah, this is really tricky because you know what it's like. Because God, nearly 30 years, and sometimes you kind of misremember things. My hunch is the feeling was that was an aberration that wouldn't happen again.
Yeah,
Galatasaray. Now that wasn't necessarily correct by any means, but I suspect. I don't remember a huge feeling of relief. I mean, I might misremember completely, but I remember thinking that even if they'd had the qualifying rounds, they'd be okay this time. I remember a decent amount of trepidation about the actual group, but not that they might have. Having said that, of course, there were some good teams in qualifying. Obviously, Gothenburg among them, who only just went through against Sparta Prague. So, but I think the attitude at the time was that I don't think anyone thought United were ready to win it or anything, because obviously things we'll talk about the ongoing problems. But I do think Galatasaray was thought of as just a kind of weird aberration that, a lost half an hour at home, basically, where they got a bit complacent and that they wouldn't allow that to happen again.
And you started very well. I mean, a home win over Gothenburg, who were dangerous. We've spoken about them on the show already. 4-2 Old Trafford. Back to the scene of the crime in Istanbul. Another 0-0 draw. This time not fatal. I mean, that's a good point. Before this double header in the middle against Barcelona. A fixture that even by that stage was a happy one. The famous game in 84. And of course, not that long ago, you've defeated this Barcelona, Johan Cruyff's dream team, in Rotterdam, 3 years before the Cup Winners' Cup final? Different players, but still, this you know how we have bogey teams. Every club has bogey teams, and we thought, oh God, not them. That wouldn't have been the case necessarily, would it?
No, not at all. The main feeling was just the kind of awe at the names they had. Obviously, Romario and Stoichkov were two of the best players at the World Cup. Hadji couldn't get a game because they could only play 3 forwarders, and Koeman was so important. So I think it was more that really than anything. I don't think it was a huge. It's difficult. Going into the home game in particular, I don't think it was a huge fear. I think the feeling. It's hard to say among fans, but certainly among the team, I think is that they could really hurt Barcelona, who, even in their best years under Cruyff, so they had won 4 titles in a row, hadn't they, going into this year, they would still take the odd absolute shellacking and the defence would be a shambles. So I think United thought, with good reason actually, the way the game panned out, that they could really hurt them at Old Trafford. There was no... and Ferguson as well, I think, has always slightly been in awe of Real Madrid because we know all about the story of him, sneaking into Hamden, seeing beat Eintracht Frankfurt. I don't think that's ever necessarily been the case with Barcelona, only maybe right towards the end, but that was purely on the merit of the team that Guardiola had rather than any kind of historical connection. And in a way, you would think Ferguson beating Madrid in 83 might have kind of killed that, but it didn't. He would be far more cagey, I think, against them than against Barcelona, generally.
Davey, I'll bring you in because Romario, Rob's mentioned Romario there. Now, we've spoken about him, we've waxed lyrical about him on this show. At the time, 92, 93, 93, even 93, 94 with Barcelona, you probably still had to be reading world soccer or really into football. This is post-America now. This is post the US World Cup, where he was sensational. He's a World Cup winner. He's now a household name across the country, and a country that is now getting used, neutrals, tuning in to watch Champions League football every second week.
Yeah, and he was a big part of that draw. The excitement, because of the novelty of we don't need to wait a few years, or as you say, subscribe to World Soccer or have a dodgy set-top box in which you could tune to get German or Spanish or Italian channels on. So
and watch the football as well.
People of my generation will remember the weird Italian game show in which people took their clothes off for apparently no reason. But yeah, you could roughly follow it if you were like me, a bit of a geek, but you didn't get the opportunity. And now here it was in glorious Technicolor, and we've mentioned before about the vibrancy. And I think it's important to remember just how exciting and vibrant Manchester United were. We're coming out of this 20 years where Liverpool just win anything, win everything, and you get the occasional Arsenal had to become very respectable and able to accumulate trophies under George Graham, but there is something about Manchester United, even to a neutral, and the fact that they had not been successful in this period, certainly for people out with England. Rob will know better what it was like there. There wasn't that anyone but United thing that would come when they began. I thought there might be in England, but there wasn't up here. People were genuinely excited by this team, and Alex Ferguson as well. There was the national pride thing there about the fact that it was a Scotsman that was doing it. I remember the first fixture was one of these glorious 90s Euro nights at Old Trafford. Maybe the first, really, where the football was electric, the crowd was electric, and for a neutral to be able to sit and watch this full 90 minutes, you just hadn't had that before. You of course have the commentary duo of the genteel Brian Moore and the uncouth Ron Atkinson working in tandem with each other. And there was something really special about it. And of course, the Barcelona side was packed with, guys like Baquero as well, who were great players, maybe not quite household names the way they would be now, but they did have this glamour. You had Stoichkov, who's almost preternaturally Eastern European, isn't he? He looks exactly like what you would imagine a glamorous Eastern European player would look like, with his unbelievable ability on the ball. But Romario, the movement, the guile, the pace that he could go at, the finishing ability, he was electric. And we're going to talk about the very famous game, probably the only one I think where I've read Manchester United players who played that night thinking that's the only time I thought I can't get near them in all the games they played, because they were just, when they clicked, when they were having one of those nights. And Rob's right, they could take some almighty doings in Spain just weirdly from nowhere against sides where I remember Deportivo La Coruña were particularly a bit of a bogey team for them, but that night they just clicked something special.
But first, there was the Old Trafford game, Rob. 2-2 it was in the end. Hughes put United ahead. Romario equalised before half-time. The aforementioned Baquero, who doesn't really get a look in. He hasn't really got a look in these shows, even though he pops up just all the time. I think he's the captain. He's certainly wearing an armband for some reason. And then Lee Sharp, who was everywhere, I think, that night, got it back. First, we're going to talk about foreigners quite a bit, not in a Nigel Farage way, in a UEFA regulations way here, because this hampered United pretty badly as it hampered us. But anyone casting an eye at the United team sheet for that first game, Schmeichel, Irwin, Keane, Hughes, Kanchelskis, well, that's 5. They've broken rules. It was 3 foreigners and two effectively naturalised players. You have to be in the country for 5 years. If you had been, then you could play 2 of those in Irwin and Hughes.
Didn't 3 of them have to be at youth level as well? That's where it got quite complicated.
Well, Gary Speed would have done that for Leeds' team.
Not necessarily at the club. I was trying to work this out because Hughes at one point was a foreigner. By this point, he's assimilated because he'd been back 6 years by now. But he'd been in the youth team at United in his first spell. So there were like 2 separate elements.
Where's the Irwin thing come from then?
So he'd have been at Leeds. Yeah, he'd been in England for over a decade and he'd have been at Leeds as a youth player. Must have been 3 years, yeah.
Looking at those highlights, Rob, very reminiscent of our 92-93, really. Wave after wave, we a lot of passion, a lot of will. Barcelona didn't have much, but when they did, they were so ruthless. The Romario chance seems to be open for a second before he has drilled it. He's so thin. He's so just lean and mean. He's just such a perfect striker at this moment in time. Whereas, United were more than value for the point, but it seemed like they had to put a hell of a lot more effort to get that point than Barca did, if that makes any sense. And that seemed to be the British story for a while. A lot of huff and puff, and these classy foreign types would just take their one chance and probably got the road with a score draw or even better. But it was an exciting night. I mean, you can sense Old Trafford is absolutely packed for this.
Yes, United was simultaneously outclassed and unlucky not to win, I thought, because they did create most of the chances, mainly through just very direct wing play. I mean, it was Sergin, some guy, I forget his name now. Was it Louis someone? Sort of fullback / wing back, and they just destroyed them. They should have, but Ferguson talked a lot around this time, and he does in his season diary, which is really interesting, about kind of vigilance and in Europe specifically, and how the roof can suddenly fall in on you, and that you think you're playing well. And that's exactly what happened. For half an hour, United really did batter them. Hughes scored 1, missed another really good chance, and a minute later, I mean, all the themes that Ferguson worried about in Europe kind of, or most of them are reflected in that goal, because Koeman takes about 4 people out of the game with a brilliant angle pass through midfield. It sells himself, tries to get it, doesn't, which is another important aspect of these games. And then suddenly Romario scores completely against the run of play. And all that good work kind of undone. Then after that, it was a bit hairy for a while, quite a long time actually. Baquero scored, but United finished really strongly. Nice goal from Sharp. Scholes had a great chip that went just over. And on balance, they could have easily won the game. I think it's worth mentioning that Ferguson left out his captain as well, Steve Bruce. He put Paul Parker at centre back to play against Romario, which in theory was a very good idea. Like Parker was the best man marker in England, definitely. The problem was that he'd hardly played a game that season because of ongoing injuries. In fact, he hardly played for United again. So he was pretty rusty. He was at fault for the second goal when he just missed a routine cross. Let Romario run for the first, which can sort of happen, offside trap and everything. But it's interesting that even when they were down to the bare bones, and they really were, you look at the bench in every game and it's just kids. Now it's kids called Beckham and Scholes who became... But the point is, at that point, for example, Nicky Butt, when he plays against the first game against Gothenburg, he starts. He's never started a Premier League game at that point. That's how desperate they were because of the foreigner rule. Butt played pretty well, actually. I remember the 4-0 away. He was probably United's best outfield player, best player. But yeah, even then Ferguson was tinkering. He was just always trying to find ways to kind of get around certain problems. And even though they went out because of 2 really bad away defeats, I think this is the game that probably cost them. They did enough to win. At that point, they were still really vulnerable defensively. Yeah, they were going into the away game. They were still vulnerable defensively at home, but they were really able to hurt teams. 4 against Gothenburg, 4 against Galatasaray, a dead game, 2 against Barcelona, could easily have been 4. So I think this more than the away games, even though it sounds a bit perverse, is the one that cost them because they played pretty well for large parts of it. But one other thing, one really small point about the foreign rule no one ever talks about. Brian McClare was kind of 8th on the list, so he never got a look in apart from when everyone else was injured. But they actually really missed him because in the Cup Winners' Cup final, he'd done a man-marking job on Koeman. It's the first time I'd heard of a forward marking a defender, but he'd done it really, really well. The Cup Winners' Cup final in '91, because obviously all their attacks went through Koeman and Guardiola. McClare was never going to play because they were already, having to leave out superior players. But they actually did miss him because no one else could do that job.
Well, someone to do that job, yeah. Adam, it's that ruthlessness though that just lifts off the screen to me when I watch that. Any thoughts looking back at this particular game?
Yeah, I didn't actually realise that Parker had played centre half. That's interesting. I assume was David May right back then, Rob?
May played right back a lot that season with very little success. It was a combination of. I think they bought May to be Bruce's replacement, and so they were trying to integrate partly because of Parker's injury problems. But yes, May will come to May and Gothenburg at right back because he had an absolute beast. But yeah, Parker it was picked specifically for that reason to play against Romario.
Yeah, I think like you've covered, I think Bakero, for example, I think is very, very underrated. I know we spoke about Begiristan on here, and probably maybe younger fans or even myself looking back didn't quite realise just how much he was involved. I don't know, you just assume when someone becomes a sporting director or an official like that, you just assume they've had a bit of an unfancied career and they've not went into coaching, so they've just became an admin board, if you like. But the fact, looking back, how fantastic he's been in some of the things we've covered, but Bakero as well. I mean, that goal was wonderful. Both their finishes, to be fair, are really, really good finishes. In this game, it sums them up, like you said, absolutely ruthless. And I guess we'll come on to talk about Hadji later on, but it just sums up. We spoke about Michael Laudrup missing the final in one of the earlier shows there, and the fact that they've got Georgie Hadji here as well, not playing in these games, just for, again, people that aren't aware of the 3 foreigner rule or anything like that. It just seems absolutely baffling.
So, I think you're right in hindsight, Rob. That was a big chance for United. So often it's the draws that are costly when you look back at Champions League groups, as Rangers fans would definitely attest in 92-93. But still, top of the group, a similar result in the Nou Camp would have been absolutely hunky-dory going into the kind of final 2 games. Manchester United are about to find out how good they really are in front of 110,000 witnesses. Your David Lacey from your paper wrote, yes, they certainly would. Ferguson having to deal with the foreigner rule. Schmeichel's one of the ones he has to leave out in Barcelona. Watching it back today, just taking back to some Rangers performances at the time, some Rangers performances that I've been to in recent days. I think of the Amsterdam Arena not that long ago, where inside about 2 minutes, fuck,
You're fucked.
this is just going to be impossible. The place just sounds wild. The team are charged into this thing, and they're quicker, they're sharper, they're just better. The first goal it's just a mess. The whole first half's a mess, and obviously ends up 4-0. Rob, just a few things. Firstly, Bruce and Pallister at this time are, they've got a lot of love, maybe at Old Trafford rather than England, right enough. But they're not there yet, are they? I mean, they're quite a bit away from what's required defensively, away from home at this level.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce was almost at retirement age anyway, so whether he would have ever managed it, I don't know. Pallister was the best centre half in England at the time, partly because Adams wasn't always playing regularly because of injuries, but he was fantastic. Nobody gave him a chasing. His pace over kind of 20, 30 yards was as good as anyone. Even he used to beat Kanchelskis and Giggs apparently over 30 yards. But Romario is just a different level. Romario basically just tormented him like you wouldn't believe. Pallister made a really interesting observation that Romario was always looking over his shoulder at him, like completely reversed the relation. Normally the defender's looking where the hell's the striker, but actually Romario was looking always, and Pallister just couldn't live with it. He looked dreadful. It's worth mentioning that Bruce played because, let me get this right now, May was both suspended and injured, and so Bruce had to play because Parker had to play at right back. Crucially, Lee Sharp got injured in a Carling Coca-Cola Cup game at Newcastle because he was actually a really important player. He played left back in Galatasaray, left wing very well, made one and scored one against Barcelona at home. I mean, look, I'm not saying any of this will make a difference, but I think it's important context to how much they had to compromise. And because of that, they had to also leave out Schmeichel, which obviously it's an eye-catching decision when you lose 4-0, but actually I don't think it changed much. In fact, they might have lost by more because Walsh wasn't really at fault, maybe for one.
No, he wasn't.
I was reading something about Paul Parker where he said, you remember when Gary Neville retired basically mid-game? Can't remember what game it was,
yeah,
but he was like,
West Brom, West
he's
Brom.
like, that this
Jerome
isn't
Thomas.
for me. I read something where Parker said something similar about playing against Romario. He was like, I kind of knew at that point that was me. Game over for elite European football. So, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's quite sad how quickly Parker his demise, mainly because of injuries. But so the team that won the double, I think they played something like 13 games together and won them all. They never played together in Europe, or indeed after that FA Cup final the previous year because of the foreigner rule. So it was just a complete mishmash. What I find interesting is that United were really exposed in midfield, even though in pretty much every game he played three in there. So in this game he's got Keane, Ince and Butt, which you would think they would put out a lot of fires.
Definitely.
Barcelona. I haven't watched the whole game back. My memory is that it was almost too easy for Barcelona. I don't know, but in my head, it isn't as awesome as, say, the 2011 final performance, which was incredible. With this, they scored early and they just sort of, United was so inept, they just kind of picked them off quite easily. I mean, there was some exhilarating moments, of course, but all four goals are a bit sloppy as well. I don't know, but maybe I've just,
No, you're right. You're right. There's a sort of contempt
exactly
in the way that Barcelona play this. That night that you mentioned there, that brilliant performance from the later Barca, that was just a great side. It didn't matter who they were up against that night. They were a machine that were doing their thing. Whereas this game, you're right, I think they sensed it. I think they had that in them, coming from Cruyff, that contempt, oh, look how great we are. I think they had it, but when they were on the right side of it, when it was controlled and, the crowd are going, and you're right, I think Martin's point that the United players sort of look at each other after a couple of minutes and go, oh, we're all having a stinker. It's
all too big. The pitch is too big. The stage, the occasion, it's just all too big for all of them at that moment in time. And the balance was crap. They had, I mean, they were missing loads of players, but I actually think that's a bit of a red herring. I just don't think they were ready at all. Ferguson had custom built a team to win the Premier League or the Division 1 because that's all that mattered at the time. And it obviously eventually adapted, but he was trying to adapt on the hoof here, and it just wasn't working really. A lot of those players were not ready, and they were also. It was a reasonably old team, so a lot of them kind of had developed not bad habits, just the habits that they needed to thrive domestically.
Successful
and it was kind of too
domestically.
late for a lot of them. Yeah, it was kind of too. Even Pallister had some okay times in Europe towards the back end of his United career, but it never was as impressive as he was domestically.
It's just such a common theme, this, Rob, of at this time, and dare say in Scottish football, it still is.
Yeah,
you can't have both.
No,
If you
you
can
couldn't
be
then,
successful
certainly.
and you can be successful in Europe if you're very sturdy and very well set up. But in order to win at home, you need to be over the top. You need to just run teams ragged. You need to take those risks about leaving yourself exposed. They're not going to expose you because they're inferior players, and that's the way you kind of do it. English football it took a while to adapt to, and maybe it was kind of Mourinho Benitez that helped to do that you could play a similar kind of game on a Sunday that you would be playing on a Wednesday night, whereas it still seemed so disparate at this point.
Well, it's worth saying.
I think people.
Sorry, go on, Adam. No, go on.
I was going to say, I think people underestimate that completely, Martin. How difficult that is sometimes. That if you're used to having 70% possession 9 games out of 10, and then all of a sudden it's 25-30% just because of another team's style, culture, ethos, it is ridiculously difficult to do. And I don't even think it comes down to it does come down to it, but it's not a team quality, etc. isn't a deciding factor. I watch some of the Premier League games just now, and for all Rangers' faults, you watch some of those games and you think if these teams played like that against us, I would fancy our chances, no bother at all. The issue that we have is obviously the 70% possession and trying to break that down. And then conversely, we deal with Europe better, or we have dealt with Europe better. But I feel like that's unique. A lot of other clubs that are doing this year in, year out will tend to be better domestically because they've got more practice at it. And I think in this game that maybe rings true as well. I read something where Ferguson said they switched from sort of zonal defending with a little bit of man marking to then obviously very specifically marking Romario, and he just pulled them apart. So it's that thing as well. These players aren't really used to dealing with these type of forwards or even having to defend that much.
That's the kind of point I was going to make about this this alien environment. I mean, David Lacey again, he's on form over the course of this week, Rob, isn't he? Pallister and Bruce were both auditioning for the role of Juliet. Romario, wherefore art thou? Romario, they were not picking up players with that kind of movement at home because they just didn't exist. They're set up for 4-4-2, the big man, wee man. But it's that it was space age stuff. But Ferguson is learning. He is obviously he's obsessed with this competition.
Yeah, he's already even before this, he's already
time
aware. This is kind of the beginning of the end. So Paul Ince played brilliantly in the home game for the most part. He was caught trying to nick that ball that leads to the first goal, but there's a brilliant piece of determination leads to the equaliser. Then I was going to say the Saturday before this, they had hammered the runaway Newcastle with a runaway lead as 2-0 in a classic English game, end to end, blah blah. Ince again was incredibly good, but in Barcelona he wasn't as good. And in the half time, him and Ferguson went like properly nose to nose. Ferguson said, "You're a fucking butler, Ince. You can't handle the stage." And Ince parents go, "Don't you dare call me a butler, Gaffer. Don't you dare." So Ferguson walks right up to him, right in his face, and goes, "You are a fucking butler." And they had to be separated. And this is kind of the beginning of the end because Ince, for the preceding 3 years, have been United's best player apart from Cantona. I don't think there's any debate about that, even though there were historically greater players there like Schmeichel and so on. He was fantastic. And even at the start of this season, he was mainly at home, but not exclusively. This is kind of the beginning of the end. And if you read Ferguson's diary, you can just sense the mounting frustration with Ince's indiscipline in particular. Tactical indiscipline, I mean, although he also gets sent off Gothenburg for swearing an Italian ref, but that's by the by. And it changed a lot. I think Ferguson was obsessed with closing gaps in midfield. He was already playing 3 in there, but they just weren't smart enough. Or maybe they were getting caught in other areas. I don't know. But it was the beginning of the end of someone who had been so important. And eventually at the end of the season, he was sold. I mean, the story is told differently. He says he went to Inter Milan and Ferguson tried to persuade him otherwise. But I think most people think that and it later came out that big time Charlie stuff. I think he thought Inter was starting to see himself as an attacking midfielder, and it cost them. But it wasn't just Inter's fault. They were just the goals were so easy. You watch the first goal and even a chance before that, and everything is so frantic defensively, incredibly frantic, and that's not a good sign in the first 5 minutes of a game. And the other thing in that game, the timing of the goals was perfect for Barcelona, early, very late in each half. So the second one right in half time when Romario scores, he just kills them, because although United hadn't played well, they were kind of in the game. And yeah, the one thing I would say about this, I don't think even with a full 11, I don't think United were equipped to win it. I absolutely don't. I don't think they were streetwise enough at all. But they were pretty unlucky, and they were better than they showed. Like, they conceded 11 goals in the group stage, and most of them were avoidable. Some of them were genuinely shambolic. And why that happened, I don't know. Maybe it was just at that stage they weren't mentally ready for that kind of level of challenge. I don't know.
Can I put in a theory as to why?
Yeah, please.
It was very similar with us at this time. British teams, with the exception of Arsenal in this era, did not understand the value of turnovers.
Yes, and Arsenal only learned the hard way when
Yes.
Benfica mugged, and I didn't realise this till recently, that was the turning point in George Graham's time at Arsenal. Benfica mugged them in 91. Well, they didn't mug them, they just picked them off in 91-92. And after that, it all changed. It's quite funny because Ian Wright had only been bought about a month earlier. And he suddenly he couldn't even play in the Benfica game because he hadn't been registered in time. But he suddenly finds that the whole system changes, and that's why Arsenal had so much success, I think. And obviously, he had a great defence as well. But Ferguson was still trying to, even though he's playing three midfield, he was still essentially thinking positively and leaving the defence more exposed than Graham ever would have done. And you're absolutely right.
Yeah, we were so used to that British thing of you have a go and then we'll have a go. And you mentioned there, I remember that Newcastle game, absolute Sturm and Drang English game, two heavyweights slugging it out. Brilliant to watch, what we all love. But how many of these games can you describe? You mentioned there that the 2-each draw, where a British side, and this happened to Rangers as well, is doing really well and then concedes. And we would always go, oh, they're more clinical than us. It wasn't, well, I mean, they were clinical, but it was down to the fact, but you just gave them the ball in a ridiculous position. And they have the talent to pick you off. And that phrase that you used, picking off, that was it. It was time after time. And we almost saw that as a bit sneaky and European, that we're going to sit in and then we'll take the ball off you when you get sloppy. And in this game, though, I think what happens is, and unfortunately I saw this a lot with Rangers in this period, was that the panic sets in and then you don't look after the ball. So when you do have the ball, you're giving it away. You mentioned the word frantic. That's exactly it. Everything becomes rushed and panicky, and that spreads throughout the side. And that was just British teams so after. There's so many great European. Do you remember Villa knocking out Inter Milan?
Yeah, that was a season
in this period. But again, it was the home performance when they just the crowd went nuts and the team got right up for it and everybody went tonto and the Inter players were going, what the hell is happening? When it ever came down to just a tactical football match, the British sides were so far behind, unfortunately. And I agree totally with Martin's point. It takes Mourinho and Benitez to come in and say, well, calm everything down, right? Learn the value of holding midfielders, etc., and things begin to develop. And then the physicality and the extreme competitiveness of the Premier League asserts itself, and we know what happens.
Here's another thing. Sorry, Rob, you go.
No, this isn't even a great Barcelona team. It's a great team on its last legs. They ended up finishing. They were in really good form going into this game, but then they ended up finishing fourth. Romario had left by January. I don't know for certain, but it feels like this was their last great night. I was going to say great performance, but I don't even know if it was.
It was the last night, for sure. It was a coda added to the
and I suppose that can happen when you're a club of United size or whoever it is, that even when players, by this point, they all hated Cruyff, or a lot of them did, but they can still summon themselves to that type of occasion.
I wonder with the Champions League, then, the regularity of games, because it is more, even if you don't have a successful period, you're still getting 6 games, 3 away games, far more used to regular continental football. Eventually, less shocked, less freaked, spooked by the big stadiums, the big noises, and for all teams,
Totally.
it's just, well, we're just playing football because right, United are blasted away. They're not out of it completely. They go to Sweden to play Gothenburg, who are dangerous, and there's
Very good side.
they've got a little following. They've got if you had hipsters in those days, and you probably did, they certainly would be a team you would look out. But United have handed them pretty nicely on match day one. And this actually, I remember ringing far more bells than the Nou Camp did. This 3-1 victory for Gothenburg. Jesper Blomqvist looking incredible. And again, on the back of everything shaped by the World Cup. The World Cups mattered in those days, don't now. But we know Sweden, they ended up, third? We know so many of these players. And United, again, were just... Well, I mean, you can tell me, but they just looked a bit shell-shocked, and it just looked like too much. Whereas a few years later, well, not so much, because we're just far more used to travelling. We know what to expect. We know we have to adapt our game in certain cases the way they just simply weren't able to then. Or am I being just too simplistic?
That's certainly how I felt watching at the time. Yeah, absolutely. I used to call this terror in the first 10, 15 minutes of away games. I can vividly remember it in the 97 final against Dortmund, actually, just because everything was so mysterious and unknown. Even you go back to the 91 Cup Winners' Cup when United had the easiest possible semi-final draw, Legia Warsaw. And in the first game, it was away, and they battered them for half an hour and could see the goal out of nothing. He's like, geez. And I remember at the time that kind of everyone saying about, this is what happened in Eastern Europe. Now, as it turned out, United beat them comfortably. But even then, against a modest team, that could happen. And Ferguson was certainly aware of that. But I think this game, I mean, there were a few things. So they had a lot of injuries this time. Schmeichel was injured. He wasn't left out. I'm trying to think who else. Giggs, Keenan, and again, crucially, Lee Sharp. So the team, they're really struggling. Cantona was back from his suspension, but they had so few foreigners that even Chucky McClare, bless him, was brought in and actually played pretty well. But the manner of the goals, again, the first goal, they're playing offside on the halfway line, which they never ever did. And it's the wonkiest line you've ever seen. It's bizarre. It's just a simple give and go. Blomqvist with, I think it's Stefan Wren. And the defending was shambolic. They got half decent goal. So the way this worked, a draw kept them alive, only just, or so they thought. But as it transpired, in the same simultaneous game, Galatasaray beat Barcelona with a late goal. So had United drawn in Gothenburg, they would have been in a great position to go through. And they equalised with good volley from Hughes. But again, it was just, everything was so just almost slapstick. Like straight after they equalise, you think, well, they've kind of finally got a footing. Blomqvist beats May far too easily, gets a cross in, and Erling Mock scores. So then May, who Ferguson almost only picked out of sympathy at right back. No, he says it in his diary, though, because Gary Neville was coming through and had played brilliantly the previous weekend against, it was a home game. I think it might have been Crystal Palace. Someone who he beat comfortably. Anyway, he says, basically, if I drop May now, what will that say to him? Blah, blah, blah. So he picked him. Blomqvist roasted him. When it went to 2-1, he thought, right, I've got to take him off. Brings Neville on. Then Neville slips for the third goal, which is nothing you could do. It's like an actual slip rather than a
mistake slip.
Yeah. All three goals Blomqvist was involved in. He was fantastic.
He was amazing. He was so hot at this point, wasn't he? He was
so
really
direct.
considered. Yeah, he was really considered one of the kind of wonder kids. But I remember this game just thinking this boy could go at the top, and bar an injury, he could have.
There's quite a nice quote from Blomqvist in The Guardian, actually, a couple of days after the game. He said, we played okay, but we shouldn't have won that easily, which kind of sums it up, really. But it's interesting that he and the manager, whose name I forget, both said that in the 4-2, they were like properly impressed by United, thought United could win the whole thing. And they couldn't believe they was the same team only a couple of months later. So maybe Barcelona had just hit morale more than we even realised.
Yeah.
But all three goals, they're bad. They are bad goals. They really are. But it's not just that. They weren't particularly brilliant going forward either away from home. But I think just away, it was too much of that. Like you say, it was so alien, so intimidating. And they hadn't played much in Europe. Even though they'd won the Cup Winners' Cup, the only vaguely hard away game had been Montpellier in the quarters.
Yeah.
Previous years, they'd lost to... Galatasaray was hard, but obviously for different reasons. So they weren't really used to playing that quality of opposition. in such important games. They just were out of their depth at that point.
And it's the impact of the ban. And I think your Cup Winners' Cup win probably was a bit of a false dawn for quite a few English clubs. That all right, we're back in business. Whereas things had moved on, but it took until maybe these years for English clubs to properly realise that we really do have to be different, and you can't just go to Sweden. I mean, Manchester United versus a Swedish club in 1984. You could just go in surely and just turn up and do your thing and do what United would have done in the Saturday.
Most people
can't do that.
Most people thought United would win going into the game, which shows the naivety. And as David mentioned before, Arsenal were the exception. They beat some very good teams to win a Cup Winners' Cup the previous year, but the rest of the
but not troubling the league championship.
But that's a whole difference. Yeah, they had become a cup team, probably partly because of Ian Wright, partly because of the Benfica thing, partly because George Graham was becoming kind of crankier and crankier in terms of wages and expenditure.
Not his expenditure.
Well, yeah. But yes, you're right. It's interesting that every year Ferguson would tip them as the main challengers. They never would, but they would always be England's best team in Europe, or certainly around that period.
But I get it's two different games. Very quickly, Rob, before we go on to speak about other teams, what is the line that you can draw from that visit to the Nou Camp to the one 5 years later?
That's an interesting point. Probably about space in central midfield. He was always obsessed with how to tighten it. Now, he didn't particularly, paradoxically, when they win the Champions League, they're generally playing 4-4-2 or a variation of that. But I think they got a lot better at tightening the space in central midfield, whether that's partly to the discipline of someone like Keane or the wide players tucking in. He talks a lot in his diary about how it doesn't come naturally to Kanchelskis to cover space inside. And Giggs was also having a crap season. So I think probably that more than anything, because even when they won it, they had those two wild 3-3 draws to Barcelona. So it's not exactly like they were watertight at the back. But also, probably that really. And I think you're right. It's just a slow, you can only learn slowly really. And they had to. The year they got to the semi-final, they actually had some quite severe doings, even if they're only 1-0. But they did just pick up a little bit more each year they were in the Champions League. I think that's the main thing. Yeah, just a greater discipline and tactical awareness among the players. I think he was always he didn't get it right all the time at all. But I think even going into it, he was always coming up with ideas and always more tactically minded than his peers in England. But I think by the time they won it, the players were, and it was a new generation. Don't forget, so they were. It's almost like in cricket, batters who've only grown up with T20. So Beckham has a really nice line in his book actually about it was almost like learning how to play football again when he started playing in Europe. But they were doing it at a young age, so I'd imagine it became a lot easier for them to learn quickly. On top of that, of course, foreigner all goes. So they're able to bring in people like Ronnie Johnson, who are kind of solid, quite smart players. So yeah, combination of that, but mainly just awareness of, as David said, transition and how the roof can fall in, to use Ferguson's phrase.
I guess it's worthwhile boxing off Gothenburg here because we've mentioned them a few times now. I mean, you mentioned naivety there, Rob, in terms of United, and I get that. Might even be interesting when we come a couple of years down the line and we're talking about Rangers Gothenburg in terms of the context here, because everyone's overriding memory is Rangers should not be beaten by Gothenburg 3-0. But when you look at the team that they've got here, I mean, 7 of these players finished third at the World Cup, as we said there, and they're a good team. I just find these stories really interesting, and I guess this might be one of the last ones. They're sort of lost now, I think, with how prevalent scouting is and the financial disparity and all that sort of stuff. You're never going to get a great Scandinavian or even a Eastern European team anymore. It's just not going to happen. They have a good 6 months and they get snapped up by Italian or German teams mostly just now. But I think it's worth just bookmarking. This was their high point, late 80s to mid 90s. Only Scandinavian team to won anything in Europe with their 2 UEFA Cups.
Winning trophies and being in finals. I mean, they were,
and they won this group handsomely. by 3 points in the
we
era of
did.
2 for a win.
They only go out
and-
in the next round to Bayern on away goals.
Yeah, no, they're a good team. And probably just because Joachim Björklund is at the heart of that defence.
Of course.
Many future Rangers players will feature over the next this show and the next one. Incredible amount. But yeah, they were superb. That's United done for. They'll be back, of course, as we said last week. Sorry, Rob, one final
One
point.
last point I forgot, actually, is that as well as midfield, Alex Ferguson also became obsessed with strikers who could run in behind. So at this point, he had Hughes and Cantona, who again worked very well domestically. The pace came from wide areas, but after that, he spent about 3 months trying to decide which English striker to buy. He ended up getting Andy Cole, was very close to getting Collymore, and he definitely became. That was another factor as well, having more pace to centre forward, which obviously had a big impact when they eventually won it.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully you'll be back to run us through 1989. But we've got plenty to discuss this week and next. Adam, you have on this series already broken down Marseille and how they were set up, and Monaco a couple of weeks ago. Another French team to look at now, and this, of course, is the introduction of Paris St Germain, who were unbelievable in this opening phase of the Champions League. I think Marseille and even Monaco were a better all-round side, more stable perhaps, but none seemed as explosive as this PSG team. Romped through their group, a group with Bayern Munich in it. Absolutely tore it apart. Goals from everywhere. Won big games, won tight games. David Ginola, looking at some of these games back, I mean, he seems to hit the woodwork about 3 times every game from distance. I mean, it's exceptional. I mean, Gino's there, the Brazilian Rai, of course, again, who had featured a little bit in Brazil's World Cup, quite hard to break in ahead of Romario and Bebeto, to be fair. And of course, George Weah, who would later go to Milan, later be World Player of the Year, later be President of Liberia. He scores tricky goals. He scores headers. I mean, he got a brilliant header, and I'm sure against Bayern, which is, Haley-esque. This, looking back, I was kind of surprised just how good they were. But I remember as a kid thinking, oh, these are glamorous. These are just super glamorous. The strip, the city, and some of these players. Tell me all about this PSG team.
So, so obviously George Weah is the star. I think that's pretty obvious to anybody who knows. But I guess we're moving away from that period where it felt like every Italian team had 3 players of the same nationality, and now PSG have George Weah as well, but they've also got a Brazilian trio of Ricardo, Valdo, and obviously Rai, who I absolutely loved. In terms of French players, they've got Lama, obviously, in goals. Alain Roche, another one who I thought was fantastic. Paul Le Guen, as we know. Vincent Guerin, and then David Ginola. Interesting, you mentioned Ginola there. He wasn't a winger here, and if you watch back the extended highlights or any of the games, he's a support striker, playing in behind, shadow striker, playing in behind George Weah for large parts of this, which I find baffling, really, because you think of him as being the wingeriest winger in the world, for want of another description. So that's really interesting. And they had something similar to Barcelona and Ajax, I would say, at this time. Ricardo, centre back, capable of stepping into midfield, giving them that extra man in a way that Koeman would do, in a way that maybe Rijkaard could do as well. I have to admit, he's not a player I knew loads about. 94 World Cup was kind of my start point. Apparently, he was supposed to captain Brazil in that tournament, but was injured at the last minute, and then just seems to have retired from international football. So I'm not quite sure what went on there. But watching it back, he's a great player. Such a good partnership with Roche, who I remember at Valencia. Don't think he played against us when we played Valencia. Alan Roche had been towards the end of his career then. But yeah, a really, really solid team. Rai, who we've mentioned, was obviously playing for. He was in Sao Paulo, and then he was Brazil before he came to PSG. Won the Libertadores, like just a fantastic footballer. And he was the captain at USA '94, but was sort of used. I think Dunga took it over towards the end of that tournament, as he was used sort of mainly as a substitute. So a really fascinating team. But George Weah, absolutely box office. There's a period in the groups where he's untouchable. I think it's November, December time. He scores a ridiculous amount of goals. I think he gets 6 in the group stages, 2 against Spartak Moscow, 1 in each game, that are just unbelievable. First one is all that explosive dribbling that we know, slaloming past defenders, and the second one I really like because it sort of channels the Kluivert goal that we'll come on to. It's just a big toe poke, but it's from the edge of the box. There's a goal he scores against Bayern that I think eclipses both of them, and it's a perfect sort of mix of them. Just an absolute force of nature. When he got going with the ball, you factor in Rai's creativity, and then I guess Ginola's composure and ability. And I think that's quite a kind of unique combination at that time. You sort of had the 2 up front and maybe a 10 in behind it at some points, but this was a little bit more like, I would say, a modern variation on a front 3. So yeah, they're a really interesting team. And I very much enjoyed watching them in the watch back for this one.
Davey, again, it's the explosion of the tournament now. 4 groups of 4. This is PSG's introduction. It's Bayern's introduction to the Champions League. We haven't seen them yet since the European Cup. Benfica as well, I think, amongst a couple of others. As the neutral, which we were by then because of Athens, it was just exciting. Every couple of weeks, you'd see the United game because that would be the live game, but the highlights were kind of must watch because you would get proper coverage, and this was the kind of team that you wanted to watch. I think we'd watch them again. What the Cup Winners' Cup was it the following season? They won the Cup Winners' Cup. Did Arsenal beat them, or was the season before? Because they were on quite a lot, and they were just so exciting.
Yeah, there was, and I think that it's maybe something for younger listeners who might think that PSG being glamorous is a new post Qatar thing, post takeover. It's not. PSG at this point felt really glamorous, really exciting. They had that brilliant strip, and as Adam has mentioned, they had these players with fabulous amounts of glamour. George Weah was revolutionary though. When you mentioned there the highlight 10:45, Martin. For the highlights program after news at 10 and the regional news and the weather, you would get them. And here was this guy who all types of goals, which I like in a striker, someone who can pick the right finish, but could dribble like a winger, except at pace, had this power that we were beginning to see in the Premier League. Not a lot of Scottish players had that athleticism in the mid-90s. Fish supper and lager diet was still reasonably popular in Scottish football. You didn't get a lot of strikers like this. And they just seemed very mysterious because French football then has now, to be honest, isn't one that tends to be the most watched here. Tends to be Spanish or Italian or even German. But you looked at the way that they played, and Adam's right. They had a kind of a system you just didn't see in Britain, which was a sort of prototype 4-3-3 with Ginola, who we all know from Newcastle and Tottenham as this electric winger, hugging the touchline and coming in. He's almost in a number 10 role and being asked to just supply great feet, obviously, and he can do that. You maybe lose some of his explosiveness, which he did have in this period because of where he's played. Rai was incredibly cultured, lovely passer of the ball, as Adams mentioned. And it was built on quite a solid defence. Guys like Alan Roche, Laurent Fournier, or aforementioned Paul Le Guen, and Vincent Guérin, who ends up at Hearts, of all places. The kind of the French, I would like to go and live in Britain, Edinburgh or London place of 35-year-old Frenchmen who headed over. So they were a really exciting side. And you're right, now you had this extra element. We'd had the live games, which was great, but now we had this extra element because there are, as you mentioned now, 16 teams, 4 groups. And the goals that we were beginning to see and the stadia, and the different fan cultures, all of this is now becoming really heady times for a young football fan who has, if you were my age, you were becoming a teenager. So you'd grown up as a big football fan, really trying to get football wherever you could. In England, of course, they had the big match on a Sunday. We didn't even have that. So to suddenly have this, and these guys that you had read about in magazines are there, and they're doing these amazing things for you, it just opened your eyes. And I think that's what, when players began to arrive in huge numbers in Britain, it's because why would you sign a Scottish or an English player when you can go and sign this astonishing guy you've seen playing in Germany or France or Spain or wherever, or Sweden, as you mentioned? And PSG, I think, were the epitome of a side that there were a lot of people. I went to university in 1995. There was a lot of PSG shirts, Martin, when I would
Pretty
go
sure
out
I had
and play
one,
football. Yeah, I mean, and that was becoming, I think they were a popular side over here because, as we've mentioned, they were very glamorous. And as Martin says, they were on the TV a fair bit through the Cup Winners' Cup, through the Champions League, etc., UEFA Cup as well.
Will I go for my fun fact now, Martin?
The 1-1 in Spain, again, Weah popping up with a goal. Barca take the lead in Paris. Our man Baquero popping up with just a big header, really, unmarked slightly in the box. So your PSG is slightly up against it, but Rai equalises. I think then Guerin gets the winner. The group perfect, 100%, 12 points out of 12. Only 2 points for a win in those days, kids. 3 points is coming in soon. But they were absolutely motoring towards Champions League final. We'll find out how they get on next week. Adam, quite quickly, I made a boo-boo earlier called Raya forward. He wasn't. He was a number 10. Are we seeing, because we've not really spoken about number 10s so much in our first few shows. We'll speak about Jari Litmanen quite a lot next week. Had used at Barcelona, but maybe not been used as much. Boban's possibly maybe popping up a wee bit further forward. I'm not quite sure what's happening at Milan. Again, we'll talk about that next week. Is there a development around now about skillful but athletic creators just behind those traditional two attackers?
I think there is, yeah, and I think we're starting to see it. So last one of the earlier episodes, we started talking about, I guess, those defensive midfielders and Desai coming to the fore as a sort of new age of that, if you like, not a sweeper, but someone that's able to play centre half and centre mid. And I think we're now starting to see number 10s sneaking in. Obviously, we've had Bergkamp, who's at Inter Milan now at this stage, but has obviously played that sort of shadow striker role at Ajax, replaced by Jari Litmanen, obviously, who again we will very much come on to. But Rai is a really good example, I guess, of what you would class as a proper number 10, I guess, a sort of literally just standing there creating. Got a fun fact about Rai. I shared it with Martin previously, just to check it wasn't something that my youth was getting the better of. So I will ask the question to Rob and David. Does anyone know who Rai's much older brother is?
Oh, fuck.
Socrates.
Socrates.
The one, yeah. I was stunned when I heard that. I was like, that feels like there's about 40 years in between them, but he's about 12 years older.
Dr. Socrates, the only footballer I have ever heard who could smoke 60 fags a day and then play maybe Prosinecki as well, but that's some family lineage, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. So yeah, there you go. It's maybe not as unique as I thought it was, but I'm sure it's an interesting one for younger players. So yeah, we'll move on to talking about number 10s. Then we'll introduce that role and how it develops, goes away for a bit, and then comes back. So Number 10, I think we all know number 10 is an attacker, plays in the spaces between midfield and the front line. Not something we've seen too much of in Britain around about this time. They play between the lines. I'm sure everyone on the planet knows by now, but it was called an enganche in Argentina in the 1980s. They were moving away from playing a 4-3-3 in Argentina to a kind of diamond style, so they called it that because enganche is the Spanish word for hook, the hook between midfield and attack. I guess Bergkamp and Zola are coming up, certainly in terms of the Premier League. So it's something that we will start to speak about more as more English teams are coming to the fore. Number 10, I guess you could characterise as often operating tight spaces under pressure, the key creator of the team. Didn't really need to do too much off the ball at this stage in the 90s, Martin. They were really difficult to mark. You see teams, it's literally like a cheat code, I think, at times. There's teams like, why is there now 4 lines of people rather than 3 lines of 3 lines of people? And they got away with sort of being elusive and dancing about the pitch until the ball sort of came to them. Some of the key number 10s that have a very good season this year. Jari Litmanen, 6 goals in the Champions League. Absolutely sensational for Ajax during this run. Just one of those guys capable of just finding space in the box, getting beyond strikers and finishing. Very different kind of number 10 to George Weah or Rai that we've mentioned. Mehmet Scholl is one who, for some reason, I always had a bit of an interest in. Bayern Munich, number 10. Quite Lampard-esque, I think, early on. He scores a couple of goals in this run that are really, really clever goals. Moves back a little bit as we get later on in the decade. And I guess I know he's not having his best time here and as his first pick, but for me, I think we spoke about Rai, but Haji is what you think of as a number 10, 100%. Low centre of gravity, brilliant with both feet, capable of just absolute magic, just off the back of the World Cup, that Romanian dream team, etc. So, there's a lot kicking about here, and there's a couple of different kinds, and we obviously even haven't had a chance to touch on all the great number 10s that are currently or just about to appear in Italy. Totti, Baggio, Rui Costa, Del Piero, even Zinedine Zidane. Even Zinedine Zidane at this stage at Juventus is a little bit further forward. So it's just such a flexible position. That's why I find it so interesting how it's evolved in the 30 years since. Each player can sort of put their different take on it, and we'll see how it progresses through the years with the guys mentioned above, and then on to Kaká, Ozil, etc. So there's a lot of range there to get through. So it's an interesting one to introduce right now.
Here's a question for you, Adam. Where does someone like Jari Litmanen play in a Pep Guardiola team?
Oh, that is a good one.
Number 8 eventually.
Yeah. I think for me, he doesn't get enough credit for what he done with Kevin De Bruyne and David Silva when he brought them back the way. He reinvented that position again. You see Arteta doing it now with Havertz and Odegaard coming deeper, and he probably doesn't get enough credit for that. So yeah, I would say so. That sort of energy and running power, I think, would be absolutely fantastic because he was unbelievable this season and many more seasons. Jari Litmanen. So yeah, I would definitely say I could see him playing as one of those attacking 8s that he's got just now.
He's got. See if you only know Jari Litmanen, folks, from Liverpool. Please go and watch these mid 94 to 97 at Ajax. The guy was just maybe suffered from as Martin mentioned. There was no chance of Finland popping up at a World Cup or a Euros, but there were some performances. I remember one that we'll come to in Greece against Panathinaikos, where it's as good a performance at top level European football as you'll ever see. He was incredible, and he was the first of these players that I began to notice that, to Adam's point there, he doesn't play in midfield or up front. That's weird. He's not slightly off a striker. He's occupying a totally different space, and he's knitting up the midfield and attack. And of course, he was a deadly finisher. He was brilliant, quick over here. But it was this new role of someone who just connected the midfield and suddenly the amount of passing you could do in the forward area and shorter passes seemed to open up, and then Bergkamp comes, as you said, Adam, and then Zola comes, and but it's hard to get across just how revolutionary it felt because I'd grown up in Britain where we had 4-4-2 and we liked it, with a big guy and a wee guy up front, which, as you know, I still think is how all football teams should be ordered to play. But this was just, it was like from another planet.
And Adam will wax lyrical about Jari Litmanen and Ajax next week in a lot more detail. Just before we wrap up here, just quickly back to PSG, Rob. And Ginola, this is the summer he went to Newcastle, right?
End of the season, yeah.
And Celtic, well, Celtic spoke to him. I think he used Celtic to get a wee bit more money out of Newcastle. But again, showing perhaps the increasing power of the Premier League that they could attract a club like Newcastle who haven't won anything in however long, could attract one of the standout performers in Europe's top competition.
Yes, although I wonder how much of that was down to Keegan. I forget the details. I know Cruyff wanted him as well, and I forget whether it was because Cruyff was about to leave or whether there was something else. But no, you're right. It was still because English football generally we think of them around this time as buying formerly great players like Hullet or even people like Vialli the year later who come for a payday and all that. And often it's seen that it changed with Zola, but actually you're right. You're absolutely right about Ginola. USA 94, I think, was a really important tournament in England because that kind of broadened awareness, and that's when people started to buy all kinds of foreign players. But yeah, it is. I'd be interested to know who else was in from, how much it was Keegan. I suppose it was a reasonably easy sell because of that, and because he would, presumably could get a few videos and see the style they played, and who wouldn't want to play that kind of stuff. But you're right,
if you like, usually
because he was. Presumably by this stage he'd been binned off for the national team, but he was still, you're right, still massively coveted. So yeah, I hadn't really thought about that actually.
Keegan told him he could play golf, and he said that was one of the things that swung him because the PSG coach had banned him from playing golf because he had a back injury, and Keegan says, if you're playing well, I don't care how often you play golf. So he said that was a big thing. He definitely did, Martin, you're right. He spoke to Celtic, but it was just to then go back to Newcastle and say, oh, by the way, they've offered me this.
It's a good point. The pre-Ravanelli in '96. Sorry, who were the other kind of big signings in there? Something resembling their pomp. There weren't many. Where Cantona obviously came in weird circumstances because he'd
you'd be similar to Ginola, I suppose. You'd be the enfant terrible and not getting kind of looking at that national level. I think '96 was the dam breaking, but Ginola, I think I had forgotten just how impressive he was in this kind of PSG. One final point, Adam, then we'll wrap up for this week.
Yeah, so I think, was it not necessarily, not that he was toxic or anything like that, but he got a kicking in France for the
Houllier sold him out.
Yeah. Houllier went right through him for failure to qualify for the 94.
Call him a murderer.
Yeah.
Perspective.
But was it not that he
didn't keep the ball by the corner flag?
Yeah. And he moved. But I thought I was going to get through one show, Martin, without a Cruyff quote. But here we are. We've got one at the last minute. He called. I think Rob said Johan Cruyff called David Ginola the best player in the world.
Wow.
At this point, on his day, he's as good as anybody. At the moment, he's having more of those days than anyone else. He's tremendous. He's a tremendous talent. I
know highlights can be so misleading, but he's involved in just about everything, and I'm not joking. He hits the woodwork 2-3 times a game, seemingly from distance,
and he's lobs and chips and stuff.
He's having a.
And he was strong as well. So easy to forget that.
He was well.
Yeah,
he famously showed John Gregory just how.
How much timber.
Anyway, that will do us for this week. Thank you, David.
Oh, an absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys. Love it.
Thank you, Adam. You'll get yourself ready for next week.
Thank you.
And Rob, thank you so much. You will be joining us this week. So it's almost as if we don't actually record these on a weekly basis, but thank you.
Cheers, gents.
We will be back next week to look at how PSG did and the up-and-coming champions of Europe. Until then, bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.